In London, 1847, beneath the polished veneer of Victorian prosperity and scientific advancement, a different reality lurked in gaslit shadows. While Queen Victoria's England projected moral superiority and intellectual progress, an unprecedented wave of brutality flowed through its cobblestone arteries. Murders of such savagery, they remained undiscussed in proper society. Medical science of the era, still enthralled with phrenology and the physical basis of consciousness, had established with absolute certainty that the human mind, particularly the undeveloped brain of a child, could neither comprehend nor retain complex memories before the age of 3. It was this foundational understanding that would be shattered entirely on November 17th, when a 5-year-old child was discovered in Spitalfields Market, speaking with terrifying precision about a murder that had occurred exactly 23 years before her birth. But before we dive into this nightmare, if you're new here and love spine-chilling stories, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you'll want to be notified when the next one drops. Now, let's begin. Police Constable Edgar Townsend discovered Eliza Winters at precisely 4:17 a.m. on November 18th, 1847, wandering barefoot through the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel. The child, small even for her 5 years, with unnaturally pale features and eyes that Metropolitan Police reports would later describe as possessing a disconcerting stillness, was speaking aloud in complete articulated sentences about what appeared to be a dream. What initially seemed the innocent ramblings of a lost child rapidly transformed into something impossible when Townsend recognized specific details about the Blackwell murder, a brutal killing that had occurred just hours earlier at 11 Dorset Street. The constable's official report, preserved in the Metropolitan Police Archives, documents his growing horror as the child described with clinical precision the exact pattern of knife wounds inflicted on Catherine Blackwell's throat, the position of overturned furniture that had not been mentioned in any public account, and most disturbingly, the missing wedding ring that investigators themselves had only discovered was absent during their preliminary examination. When brought to Scotland Yard for questioning about how she had obtained this knowledge, Eliza demonstrated neither fear nor confusion. Instead, as noted by Inspector James Holloway in his personal diary, she began methodically describing 7 additional murders, each unsolved, each committed with distinctive methodology, and each containing details that had been deliberately withheld from newspaper accounts. The most unsettling aspect, wrote Holloway, was not merely the child's knowledge of these crimes, but the manner in which she recounted them, with the detached precision of one who had witnessed each murder from an impossible vantage point, as though she had somehow occupied the same space as both victim and perpetrator simultaneously. Medical examination confirmed Eliza had suffered no physical harm, but physicians noted with growing unease that when recounting these murders, her pulse remained perfectly steady, her pupils failed to dilate, and her body temperature dropped measurably by 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Something fundamental about this child defied all contemporary understanding of human physiology and consciousness, a mystery that would soon attract the attention of England's foremost medical authorities and transform a simple case of a lost child into what the Times would later call the most profound challenge to scientific understanding of the human mind documented in modern history. Dr. James Thornfield, Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and author of the distinguished 1843 monograph on disorders of memory and consciousness in juvenile subjects, was summoned to examine Eliza Winters on November 23, 1847. His meticulously maintained case notes recently discovered in a sealed archive at London's Royal Society of Medicine, document his transition from clinical skepticism to profound intellectual disturbance. I approached the child as one would any case of apparent delusional disorder or advanced hypnotic suggestion, he wrote in his initial assessment. The psychological literature documents numerous instances of children with abnormal fixations on violence, typically resulting from direct trauma or exposure to inappropriate materials. This explanation collapsed entirely during their third session on December 4th, when Eliza began describing, with anatomical precision, that Thornfield himself found challenging to follow, the 1829 murder of Lord William Russell, a case that had occurred 13 years before her birth. His notes record with increasing agitation how the child recounted specific details about the angle of the fatal wound, the exact position of furniture items in Russell's bedchamber, and most disturbingly, the killer's breathing pattern in the moments after the murder. These details were subsequently verified against court documents that had been sealed by judicial order and were inaccessible to the public. Thornfield's methodology became increasingly rigorous as his discomfort grew. He developed a systematic approach of presenting Eliza with collections of crime scene photographs, some authentic, others staged specifically for these sessions, noting that the child unfailingly identified actual murder scenes with 100% accuracy, often providing details absent from the photographs themselves. By January 1848, Thornfield had documented Eliza's knowledge of 27 separate murders, spanning from 1803 to 18, each verified against police and court records. 16 of these crimes had occurred before her birth in 1842. The physician's private correspondence with colleague Dr. Michael Faraday reveals his growing existential distress. What began as a curious anomaly has transformed into something that threatens the very foundation of our understanding of consciousness. I find myself constructing increasingly fantastical theories, metempsychosis, inherited cellular memory, even some form of temporal displacement, each more absurd than the last, yet the conventional explanation remains more impossible still. Most disturbing was Thornfield's observation that when recounting these murders, Eliza's voice frequently shifted in subtle but measurable ways, adopting inflections and speech patterns that varied between accounts. "It is as though," he wrote in his final entry of January, "I am not speaking with a single child at all, but rather with something far more complex and far more terrifying than our current science permits us to comprehend." By February 1848, Dr. Best Thornfield had established a methodical collaboration with Inspector Holloway, systematically cross-referencing Eliza's accounts against both solved and unsolved murder cases throughout the British Isles. The findings, documented in a leather-bound volume, preserved in the British Library's restricted collection, reveal a pattern that defied all rational explanation. Between February 8th and March 17th, Eliza provided detailed accounts of 43 additional murders spanning from 1791 to 1847, a temporal range extending 51 years before her birth, and across geographical locations as disparate as Edinburgh, Dublin, York, and even as far as Calcutta. What emerged with disturbing clarity was not merely the child's impossible knowledge, but the precision with which she recalled specific environmental details. The exact arrangement of raindrops on a window pane during a Liverpool murder in 1822, the specific pattern of peeling wallpaper in a Devonshire cottage where a family of 4 was slaughtered in 1837, and most disturbingly, the precise sensory experiences of numerous victims in their final moments. The child described the metallic taste that filled Margaret Thatcher's mouth as the garrote tightened around her throat in 1815, Inspector Holloway noted. This detail was mentioned only once in the victim's sister's testimony, in a closed court proceeding for which no public record exists. The medical establishment divided sharply as knowledge of the case cautiously circulated among London's scientific elite. Dr. William Benjamin Carpenter, prominent physiologist and author of Principles of Mental Physiology, led the skeptical faction, attributing Eliza's knowledge to an elaborate hoax perpetrated by parties with access to police records, using the child as an unwitting medium. The renowned alienist, Dr. Forbes Winslow, proposed a case of spectral illusion and hypermnemonic capacity, stimulated by some environmental exposure to criminal matters. These explanations withered under scrutiny when Eliza revealed precise details about the 1808 Whitmore family murders, a case whose records had been destroyed in a fire at the Old Bailey in 1820. Most unsettling was the pattern that emerged in the murders themselves, not in methodology or victim type, but in the emotional states of the perpetrators. The child describes with unprecedented psychological insight the precise emotional progression experienced by each killer, Thornfield wrote. From the initial detachment to the moment of physiological acceleration, to the distinctive qualitative experience that appears to accompany the act itself, a pattern so consistent across cases separated by decades that it suggests something unfathomable, that murder itself may possess a specific phenomenological signature, one somehow accessible to this child across the barriers of time, space, and conventional sensory perception. April 1848 marked the beginning of Dr. Thornfield's systematic experimentation phase, conducted within the controlled environment of his private clinic at 17 Harley Street. The testing protocols, documented in his monograph, Investigations into Anomalous Cognition, represented the most rigorous scientific approach possible with the methodologies available in Victorian England. Thornfield first established baseline parameters of Eliza's knowledge through double-blind presentations of crime scene materials, photographs, personal effects, and location descriptions, with neither Thornfield nor his assistants knowing which items were connected to actual murders and which were fabricated decoys. The results defied conventional explanation. When presented with 47 mixed artifacts, Eliza identified all 22 authentic murder-related items with 100% accuracy, often providing details about the crimes that were verifiable through official records, but absent from the presented materials themselves. Most disturbingly, when touching objects directly connected to murder victims, a glove, a watch chain, a hair ribbon, the child's physiological responses became measurable and alarming. Her pupils dilate to twice their normal diameter, Thornfield recorded after one such session on April 11th. Her body temperature drops precisely 3.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Most remarkably, using the newly developed chemograph, we have documented that her heartbeat temporarily adopts the exact rhythm of the victim's final cardiac patterns, as recorded in their autopsy reports. Limitations to Eliza's knowledge emerged with equal significance. The child demonstrated no special insight into crimes of lesser violence, no matter how recent or well documented. Attempted murders, regardless of their brutality, elicited no response. Most revealing was her complete inability to describe any murder where the perpetrator had acted in genuine self-defense or without murderous intent. It appears, Thornfield noted with growing unease, that what the child perceives is not the act itself, but rather the specific psychological state that accompanies intentional homicide, a particular quality of consciousness that occurs when one human being deliberately extinguishes the life of another. By May, the psychological strain on Eliza had become unmistakable. Her weight dropped precipitously. She developed a persistent tremor in her right hand. Her previously articulate speech became increasingly fragmented when not describing murders. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States and a visiting consultant on the case, noted with alarm that the child exhibits classic symptoms of exhaustion and psychological fragmentation, as though these memories, if indeed they are memories, are consuming her from within. As interest in the case grew among senior government and medical authorities, the first disturbing pattern connecting the murders emerged. Thornfield discovered that in 27 of the cases Eliza had described, the murderers had reported strikingly similar sensory experiences during the act: a distinctive rushing sound, a momentary perception of time slowing, and most alarmingly, a fleeting sense of another presence at the scene, observing. The implications of this pattern would prove more terrifying than anything Thornfield had initially conceived possible. The inevitable breach of confidentiality occurred on June 7, 1848, when the Times of London published a front-page article titled "The Seer Child of Whitechapel, Impossible Knowledge of Murder." Within 48 hours, the story had been reprinted in 17 newspapers across England, Scotland, and as far as Paris and New York. By June 12th, crowds had begun gathering outside Dr. Thornfield's Harley Street clinic, forcing the physician to relocate Eliza to an undisclosed country estate in Hampshire under armed guard. The public reaction, as documented in contemporary accounts, ranged from macabre fascination to outright terror, with the Illustrated London News selling out 3 consecutive printings of their sensationalized engravings depicting the child who remembers murder. Religious authorities inserted themselves forcefully into the controversy. The Bishop of London, Charles James Blomfield, proclaimed from the pulpit of St. Paul's Cathedral that the child represented incontrovertible evidence of demonic possession, a vessel through which the accumulated evil of mankind's violence manifests. Conversely, the evangelical movement led by William Booth, later founder of the Salvation Army, declared Eliza a divine instrument of justice, granted the gift of perfect witness to mankind's concealed depravities as warning against the coming judgment. The Catholic Church maintained an official silence on the matter, though Vatican archives recently declassified reveal Pope Pius XIX commissioned a confidential investigation into the case. The scientific establishment fractured along ideological lines. Sir James Clark, physician to Queen Victoria, dismissed the entire phenomenon as hysteria fueled by methodological inadequacies and the suggestibility of the juvenile mind. Meanwhile, the emerging psychiatric community, led by Dr. John Connolly, proposed a revolutionary theory of murder-specific telepathy, suggesting that extreme acts of violence may create enduring impressions upon the fabric of reality itself, accessible to certain sensitive minds. For Eliza Winters, the consequences proved devastating. Medical records from late June document her rapid physical deterioration: weight loss of 19 pounds in 16 days, spontaneous nosebleeds, seizure-like episodes, and most alarmingly, the appearance of inexplicable bruising that precisely matched the wound patterns of victims she had described. The child's cellular structure appears to be mimicking the physical trauma of the murder victims, Dr. Thornfield wrote on July 2nd. It is as though these memories possess a physiological component that manifests within her body. By mid-July, Eliza had lost the ability to speak except when describing murders, her normal vocabulary entirely replaced by fragmented recollections of violence. Her eyes, once described as unnaturally still, now darted constantly, as though tracking movement invisible to others. Most disturbing was her increasing tendency to physically reenact the deaths she described, her small body contorting into positions that forensic analysis confirmed matched those of victims at their moments of death. "We are witnessing," wrote Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell in her final consultation notes, "not merely the mental collapse of a child, but something far more profound and terrifying. The physical manifestation of remembered violence across barriers of time that our science cannot begin to comprehend." Dr. Thornfield's breakthrough occurred on August 17, 1848, during an 18-hour analytical session that would fundamentally transform the investigation. Having meticulously catalogued all 112 murders Eliza had described to date, Thornfield applied a newly developed statistical methodology to identify correlational patterns across cases spanning from 1791 to 1847. What emerged was not merely unexpected. It defied the foundational understanding of criminal psychology established since Cesare Lombroso's earliest work. The murders were not random acts at Sabiez perpetrated by unrelated individuals, but rather displayed unmistakable methodological signatures that transcended geographical boundaries and generational divides. "The evidence suggests something unprecedented," Thornfield wrote in his private journal, later confiscated by the Home Office. "We are observing what appears to be 7 distinct families of murder, each with specific ritualistic elements, weapon preferences, and post-mortem manipulations that remain consistent across decades, despite being committed by different perpetrators who could not possibly have communicated with one another." Most disturbing was the precise 27-year cycle that emerged for certain signature elements, specific wound patterns that disappeared completely only to re-emerge nearly 3 decades later in murders committed hundreds of miles apart. On September the 3rd, a fundamental shift occurred in Eliza's revelations. During what began as a standard documentation session, the child's vocal pattern altered dramatically as she began describing not the victim's experiences, but those of their killers. "The transition was immediate and profound," noted Inspector Holloway, who was present. "Her facial musculature rearranged itself into expressions I have witnessed only in the most hardened criminals during confession." Over the subsequent 19 days, Eliza provided detailed accounts of the murderers' experiences, their specific thought processes before, during, and after their crimes. The most alarming pattern emerged when comparing these killer profiles against court records and confessions. In 23 cases where perpetrators had been captured and interrogated, Eliza's descriptions of their internal experiences matched their confessions with inexplicable accuracy, including private thoughts and sensations the killers had never revealed to anyone. More disturbing still was her revelation about what connected these killers across generations. Each had experienced an identical sensory phenomenon in the moments before committing murder. "They all hear it," Eliza explained in a session recorded verbatim by Thornfield's assistant. "A sound like rushing water getting louder, and then a voice that isn't speaking words exactly, but is showing them exactly how to do it. And they all see the same shadow standing in the corner watching, tall and thin and bent in a way that human bodies don't bend. It's been watching for centuries. It shows them, and then it watches through their eyes, and then it remembers everything through me. This revelation forced Thornfield to consider a hypothesis so disturbing that his notes from this period become increasingly fragmentary and disordered. The murders appeared to be connected not by human agency, but by something that existed outside conventional understanding of consciousness itself, something that had been systematically influencing susceptible individuals for generations, creating a consistent pattern of violence that transcended the lifespan of any single perpetrator. By October 1848, Eliza Winters existed in a state that defied medical classification. Her weight had diminished to 31 pounds, approximately 40% below normal for a child her age. The systematic hair loss, peripheral cyanosis, and intermittent catatonia documented in Thornfield's medical records painted a portrait of catastrophic physiological collapse. Most disturbing were the inexplicable physical manifestations that appeared on her body, ligature marks materializing around her throat, precise bruising patterns that matched victims from decades past, and on 3 documented occasions, spontaneous lacerations that formed in perfect correspondence with historical knife wounds she had described. Dr. Thornfield faced an escalating ethical crisis. "I find myself trapped between scientific obligation and basic human compassion," he wrote on October 11th. "Each new revelation advances our understanding of this phenomenon, yet the cost to this child becomes increasingly unconscionable." His requests to suspend further investigation were overruled by a special committee appointed by the Home Secretary, who insisted that national security implications necessitate continued research, despite unfortunate consequences to the subject. The breaking point arrived at precisely 2:17 a.m. on October 23, 1848. Nurse Mary Glendale's sworn statement describes how Eliza, previously catatonic for 36 hours, suddenly sat upright in her bed, eyes wide, speaking in a voice entirely unlike her own, deeper, masculine, with a distinctive Northumbrian accent. The child began describing, in present tense, a murder occurring at that very moment, providing the exact address of 14 Dorset Street, Spitalfields, detailing how a man named Edward Thorne was in the process of strangling his wife Catherine with a length of dressing-gown cord, after discovering letters revealing her infidelity. Inspector Holloway, maintaining a constant presence at the facility due to escalating concerns about Eliza's condition, immediately dispatched officers to the location. According to Metropolitan Police records, they arrived to find Edward Thorne with his hands still around his wife's throat, the woman unconscious but alive. The interrupted murder exactly matched Eliza's description in 27 distinct details, including the specific pattern of furniture disruption and the exact wording of the argument that had preceded the attack. Thorne's subsequent interrogation, preserved in Scotland Yard archives, contains the most disturbing verification of Eliza's abilities. When questioned about his motive, Thorne described experiencing a rushing sound, like standing beneath a waterfall, moments before attacking his wife, followed by the distinct impression of being watched by something standing in the corner, something tall and wrong-looking. Most chillingly, he reported feeling as though a child was somehow there, seeing everything I did. The strain of this final revelation proved catastrophic for Eliza. Within minutes of describing the Thorne attack, she suffered a series of violent seizures that left her in a state described in medical terminology of the era as profound neurasthenic collapse. Her pulse became erratic, her respiration shallow and irregular. By dawn, she had lost all ability to speak or respond to external stimuli. "What we are witnessing," Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell noted in her final consultation, appears to be the complete fragmentation of a consciousness that has been forced to contain experience beyond human capacity, as though the accumulated weight of witnessing centuries of violence has finally crushed whatever remained of this child's original self. The ethical questions surrounding the case intensified as Eliza's condition deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, raising profound questions about the price of knowledge and the moral responsibility of those who had pursued it, regardless of cost. On November 17, 1848, exactly 1 year after Eliza's discovery, Dr. Thornfield completed his final theoretical framework. The exhaustive 437-page document, sealed under royal order until its partial declassification in 1923, contains what contemporary experts in consciousness studies now recognize as a revolutionary hypothesis that anticipated quantum entanglement theory by nearly a century. The revelation emerged from Thornfield's discovery of an overlooked detail in Eliza's birth records. She had been delivered exactly at the moment of a documented murder in the adjacent room of the same workhouse, the killer's execution occurring precisely 5 years later, on the very night she began speaking of murders. "What we are witnessing," Thornfield wrote, "is not merely an anomaly of memory or perception, but evidence of a fundamental property of consciousness itself, one that contradicts our most basic assumptions about its individual nature." His hypothesis, developed through collaboration with mathematician Augustus de Morgan, proposed that consciousness might function as what they termed a persistent field, one that permeates reality rather than remaining isolated within individual minds. Under specific circumstances involving extreme psychological states, particularly the heightened consciousness associated with murder, this field could become impressed with experiences that remained accessible to certain sensitive individuals. Eliza's autopsy on December 8, 1848, conducted after her heart simply ceased beating during sleep, revealed the final, most disturbing connection. The child's brain contained a previously undocumented anatomical anomaly, a structure within the medial temporal lobe that Thornfield termed the memoria collective, a dense cluster of neurons arranged in patterns that, when mapped, corresponded precisely to the geographical distribution of every murder she had described. Most terrifying was the discovery of microscopic cellular formations within this structure that appeared to be growing in patterns identical to historical murder locations she had not yet revealed. "We must consider the unthinkable possibility," Thornfield wrote in the final pages of his documentation, "that what we have identified as Eliza Winters may never have been a conventional human consciousness at all, but rather a nexus point, a temporal and psychological convergence where the experiences of murderer and victim throughout history have accumulated into a single, impossible awareness. The child appears to have functioned as a living repository of violence, a biological recording mechanism capturing murder's specific phenomenological signature across time." The investigation's devastating conclusion came on January 7, 1849, when Thornfield made his final entry before the Home Office permanently suppressed the case. Historical records confirm that on this date, the physician gained access to parish records documenting Eliza's maternal lineage, revealing that her direct female ancestors, traced back 7 generations, had all died violently on their 5th birthdays. Most horrifying was his discovery about Eliza's mother, Catherine Winters, executed in 1847 for murdering 6 children in a pattern identical to killings from 1793 that Eliza had described in precise detail. The pattern suggests something beyond coincidence or conventional explanation, reads Thornfield's final documentation. "We appear to be observing a multi-generational transmission of murder consciousness, a hereditary capacity to access what can only be described as murder's collective memory. If my hypothesis is correct, Eliza Winters was not merely describing murders. She was, in some fundamental sense, experiencing herself as both perpetrator and victim across centuries, a living intersection where violence remembers itself.